All right, team, let's go. Welcome to the first three units of AP Environmental Science first semester review. There's a little bit of clunkiness. It's all my fault. Anyways, we are going to go ahead and go over the first three units of objectives for the first semester final. I'm omitting, I will say a couple of things at the end of all this, but I am omitting the last couple of units because we just did those. So refer back to your notes. I will also post the PowerPoint for Unit 4, and I would strongly encourage if you want to review things from Unit 5 to go back and look at that video that I made of models 1 through 8, as that will be probably the main focus in addition to sustainable ag techniques, which we just did a group quest on and made some farms about. So, but I think probably the biggest area of focus for y'all would be units 1 through 3. So let's get started. All right, the first objective is environmental studies versus sciences. Environmental studies is broader than environmental sciences, which is more specific. You guys can see on this diagram here, environmental sciences include things like environmental chemistry and biology and toxicology. Whereas if you get a degree in environmental studies, that also includes many other fields, ethics, economics, literature, etc. We measure the health of the planet using something called environmental indicators. And our text has chosen 5 environmental indicators, which are right here. I'll go into each of these 5 here in just a second. The first one, biological diversity, which we are in our 6th mass extinction. It is an anthropogenic extinction, which means human driven. That first indicator we'll come back to as it is the topic of an entire unit, that being unit 3. So let's talk about food production per capita. So make sure you guys remember that per capita means per person. So the food production per capita, as we look at these trends, is going down over time. And that's because the loss of arable land, which we talk about in unit 5. And it's also due to the fact that the human population is increasing. You put those two things together, and food production per person is going to be going down over time. We mentioned loss of arable land. That's for a lot of different reasons, such as desertification, poor management of topsoil. But also one of the other things we need to think about is overuse of water. And we'll come back to water resources in unit 2, but something worth thinking about. This is a big topic right here, talking about the greenhouse gas effect, which is the idea that certain gases in the troposphere, such as carbon dioxide and methane, CO2 and CH4, trap outgoing infrared radiation, and that causes the Earth to be warmer. It's like a little blanket around the Earth. And we have, because of burning of fossil fuels, because of deforestation, and a lot of other factors, we have increased the number of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The number one anthropogenically increasing greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is carbon dioxide. And so the Earth is slowly getting warmer. It's warmed by about 1.1 to 1.2 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times, when we really started ramping up our burning of fossil fuels. And so the Earth is warming. The carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are going up. The next indicator is the human population. All right, so the human population is going up. It's been following for a while an exponential growth model. The growth of the human population is starting to slow down, but if you were asked, you would still say that the human population is growing exponentially. Our current population is 8 point, I have to look it up right now, 8.1, 8.2 billion people. And the population of the US, which is another one you need to know, is about 340 million people. All right. As far as where this population growth is happening, most of it's happening in developed countries, which tend to be in the southern hemisphere. Not all countries in the southern hemisphere are developing, but we have a map down here of the shaded ones are our developing countries. And that's where 97% of the population growth is happening. In developed countries, a lot of their populations are actually starting to decrease. Now, that being said, you can see the statistic in number 8 here, which, yes, that's where most of the population growth is happening in developed countries, but most of the resource consumption is done by people in developed countries, even though we're just a small slice of the population. This is the equation for ecological footprint. I equals PAT. P stands for the population of a country. A stands for affluence, which is the amount of consumption per person. And then T stands for technology, which is the impact per unit of consumption. And this is just kind of a general idea, but it is our ecological footprint, which, if you remember, you calculated your ecological footprint. And it's the same idea between like a water footprint, a carbon footprint. Basically, it's looking at, in terms of ecological footprint, how much land it would take to support your lifestyle, and in terms of the carbon footprint, how much carbon you put in the atmosphere per year. All right, you will definitely be asked to do some science designy things, okay? Like give it an experiment, predict what the hypothesis for the experiment was. And I always encourage you to use an if this, then that, but make sure it's a directional hypothesis. And that means make sure that it is an if this thing increases, then that thing decreases. And when I say thing, we're talking about variables, right? So we're talking about make sure you know the difference between an independent variable. That's the thing that we are controlling in the experiment, right? This thing that goes on the x-axis if we were to be graphing it. And then the dependent variable is the thing that we're measuring in response, right? Dry mix was an acronym that we used if you look back at your notes. And then the control variables are all the things that we keep the same. It's a little bit different than the control group. The control group is the group that we don't change. Like in this particular experiment, right, we're changing the color of lights, right? So the control group would just be the one where it just has standard light. In our salinization of seed labs, our control group was the group where we didn't change the percent salt water. It was just pure water. And you need to have a control group to make sure that in the case of salinization of seeds, that the seeds were actually germinating. Just going back here, the larger the sample size, the more accurate your results will be. And so it's important to have a large sample size. As far as watershed, remember a watershed is an area of land that all water all drains to the same area. And if you're asked to do a watershed calculation, you would take the area of the watershed and you would put it into the same units as the depth of the rainfall, and you would multiply those together. And so for this one here, you would, how many hectares in 2,000 meters squared if 1 kilometer equals 100 hectares, right? So we would take 2,000 meters squared times 1 kilometer per 1,000 meters, and we would square that conversion factor, use it twice, times 100, and then that would times 100 hectares per 1 kilometer squared, and that would give us hectares. And then for this one down here, if a forest being cleared at a rate, how many hectares per year being cleared? So this is just another conversion one, and I'd be happy to write it out and go over it, but I don't have my iPad in front of me right now. So I can come back to that, and I can certainly cover it in class or after school if you want to do some more calculation practice. I would encourage you also go back. There is a video under Unit 1 on how to do math and APES, and it has examples of all these. All right, so sustainability. Sustainability is not degrading our natural capital, which natural capital are natural resources, right? Things that we can extract from nature, and also all of the ecosystem services of nature. Okay, so speaking of ecosystem services, there are 4 categories of ecosystem services. These are things that ecosystems do that are of value to us. There are supporting. Let me start with provision. Provisioning ecosystem services are sometimes called natural resources. These are the things that we can extract from nature, things like sand, wood, food. Then there's supporting ecosystem services, and that's like the idea that nature makes soil for us, nature provides biodiversity and habitat. There's regulating ecosystem services, that's regulating of temperature, regulating of climate, the whole idea of like wetlands, regulating floods. And then there's cultural ecosystem services, and those are things that we can, such as recreation, maybe a spiritual connection to something larger than us. Those are all examples of education, of cultural ecosystem services. Okay, supply and demand. Just real quick, this is just the whole idea that the equilibrium price of a product is determined by how much is how much consumers demand at a price and how much suppliers supply at a certain price. And where these things meet, that ends up being the price and then the quantity supplied. And real quick, the purpose of this is really going after number 18, and that's the idea that goods often are priced without factoring in the cost to the environment. So if we did factor in the cost to the environment, these are our externalities. Externalities are cost to the environment, not included in the cost of the good. Then the price would go up, and so the demand would go down. And examples of externalities are water pollution, air pollution, habitat loss, all of the things that have an impact on the environment that are not factored into the cost of the good. And we'll come back to that concept in just a little ways. But ultimately, what this gets at is we're talking about tragedy of the commons, right? And this is when we tend to have externalities. And tragedy of the commons is the idea that we have a shared public resource that everybody has access to, and people act in their own interest, and the resource is degraded to the cost of everybody. In this case, it's sheep grazing on a field. All the farmers are able to put their sheep on the field. There was no grass left, and then all the sheep die. We did an activity where we were looking at tragedy of the commons with respect to ocean fisheries, and everybody has access to the ocean. We can overfish unless we have, and here's my example of externalities, right? Unless we have some sort of approach to enforcing some rules around use of the resource, right? And those rules would be under one of these three categories. I'm looking at number 19 now, command and control, which is where you set a rule, and if you break the rule, you are penalized. An incentive-based approach, which is where you give people something for following the rule, or green tax, where you say you can break the rule, but we're going to tax you for breaking the rule. Those are the three strategies taken to modify human behavior to help the environment by reducing externalities. And there is our definition of externalities. I think my definition was cost to the environment, not include in the cost of the good. Okay, so saltwater intrusion comes up in Unit 1. That's where we overdraft an aquifer. And so instead of just the water table, the top level of the aquifer going down, salt water starts to move in. And eventually we are using groundwater, which is now ocean water or really salty water, to water our plants. And that does not work well for crops. It does not work well for drinking, because crops that we grow, most crops that we grow and drinking water, are not made to be watered with salt water, or we are not made to drink salt. And in our local area, it's a problem because, yeah, we are overdrafting our local aquifers, and that is causing the salt water layer there to start moving into our groundwater. All right, so when we talk about renewable versus non-renewable resources, renewable resources are resources that can regenerate at that we use at a rate that they can regenerate. That's when we're using renewable resources sustainably. And those are things like clean air, clean water, food, trees, they can all grow, versus non-renewable resources exist in finite amounts. That means fixed amounts. So things like fossil fuels, metals, minerals, nuclear fuel, sand, those type of things that take millions, if not billions, not hundreds of millions of years to form, I should say. Okay, and then I'm just looking at number 22 here. This make sure, and we'll come back to this. You just know that the earliest Earth had very simple cells, prokaryotes, and those cells evolved into eukaryotic, more complex life. But before that happened, the earliest prokaryotes, cyanobacteria, they started photosynthesizing, right? And that's where we take carbon dioxide plus water to yield sugar and water. They started sorry, carbon dioxide plus water to form sugar and oxygen. And so they started putting photosynthesizing, taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then putting oxygen out to the atmosphere. And so those led to oxygen in the atmosphere, which completely changed life on Earth, which went from simple cells to more complex cells to multicellular life to life in the oceans, and then eventually life as we know it here on Earth on land. And humans have been around just for the blink of an eye, about 100,000 to 200,000 years. And in that blink of an eye, in the past 50 years, we are the force causing the sixth mass extinction. Okay, so 23, I'm just going to say go back to that math review if you need to review. Make sure you guys know how to convert millimeters, centimeters, meters, and kilometers. There's 1,000 millimeters in a meter, 100 centimeters in a meter, and 1 meter equals 1,000 kilometers. Okay. So in unit one, we also watched a video about how tragedy of the commons is happening on lands in the United States. And so we went over some protected categories of land, which include a lot of federal lands, and most protected lands in the United States. You can see the vast majority are in the Western United States because that was colonized by us later. And we protected a lot of these areas before people moved there. And so we looked briefly at different categories of federally protected land, all the way from BLM land, that's Bureau of Land Management, which is the least protected category of land, to the U.S. Forest Service. They are in charge of national forests, which in national forests, you may cut down trees, you may build homes in national forests, but you need permits to do so. BLM land, you may also do a lot of things, but a lot of these things, such as mining, are you don't need permits for. And then we also have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They generally have some of the most protected areas. A wilderness area would probably be the most protected roadless area. And then the National Park Service has national parks, which are made for both protection of nature and also enjoyment and recreation for people. So these are all, I will also say as we jump ahead to Unit 3, these are all ways of protecting an entire ecosystem. So these are all ecosystem-based management approaches to helping wildlife out. Okay, so you guys know the difference between selective harvesting and clear cutting. Clear cutting is generally more short-term economically beneficial. It's also easier to just clear cut a forest. The issue with clear cutting is it can lead to desertification because the soil is not covered. It can erode and obviously causes significant disruption to wildlife. Whereas selective harvesting is where you're just cutting down certain trees. It is a little bit trickier to do, so it ends up being a little bit more expensive. But ultimately, you still have a forest, and you can selectively harvest a forest in a way that would be considered sustainable. And that gets to kind of another couple other few topics. In fact, I'll just say the maximum sustainable yield, which that's like the highest rate at which you can extract something, either fish from the ocean or forest from a forest, or trees from a forest. It's the maximum rate at which you can extract something that the population can recover, either trees or fish, etc. Also in this little side unit, we address forest fires and their benefit. So forest fires have some downsides, and that's that they release a lot of greenhouse gases. They also destroy a lot of habitat, but also forest fires can be beneficial, and that's why we do a lot of prescribed burns. In fact, we just did one over at Point Lobos. It just happened, and the reason for that is it can open up the cones of cone-bearing plants so that their seeds drop out. It can help control invasive species. It can kill off older diseased trees and provide an ecological niche for new trees to come out. And it also lowers the risk of more dangerous fires in the future by reducing the fuel level of stuff that can burn. Okay, now we get into Unit 2 concepts. So I am not going to go through everything in the water cycle except to say make sure you know all the steps in the water cycle: evaporation, condensation into clouds, precipitation down to land. And then water goes through the soil. That is called infiltration. And then it goes down into the groundwater and moves through the groundwater through a process called percolation, or it can hit the land and run off. And that is the water cycle, which, remember, the water cycle is powered by the sun. Okay. The one process I didn't mention that I should is when water moves up through a tree, that is called evapotranspiration. Make sure you guys understand how humans impact the water cycle, and I'll come back to that in a few slides. Make sure you guys know the nitrogen cycle. There will be several questions on the nitrogen cycle. So there's 4 ways that most nitrogen is in the atmosphere. 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, and nitrogen can go from the atmosphere to ammonia slash ammonium, and that's NH3 and NH4, and that happens through lightning. It happens through bacteria in the soil. It happens through bacteria in the root nodules of legumes, and also humans artificially fix nitrogen through a process called the Haber process or the Haber process. And we have nitrification, which is where the ammonia. Oh, we just lost our light. Let me move. Is where our ammonia turns into nitrites and then nitrates, NO3, and then nitrates can be assimilated into plants. And then any of these forms of nitrate can then be turned back into the gaseous form, and that's called denitrification. Ammonification is what happens when animals eat plants, or animals eat animals with nitrogen in them, and then that is converted back into ammonia and ammonium, which is then peed out. Sure, you guys review the nitrogen cycle. Phosphorus cycle has no atmospheric component. We mine phosphorus for phosphates, just as we fix nitrogen for into nitrates for fertilizers. We also mine phosphorus for fertilizers. Phosphates are I'll come back to that. Anyways, yeah, so phosphate is mostly contained in rocks, and it can be weathered and eroded and then transported down to the bottom of the ocean. But all living things need phosphorus to survive. So limiting factors. So these are things that a factor that has the capacity to restrict the growth, abundance, or distribution of population ecosystem. This could be water. This could be sun. The main limiting nutrient, limiting food, which I will ask you about on land in terrestrial areas, is nitrogen, and in water it is phosphorus. And that means that if you add a bunch of phosphorus or nitrogen to water, you will cause an algal bloom, and you'll get a process called cultural eutrophication. That is where you have an algal bloom, the algae die, the algae are decayed, and then in the decaying process, those bacteria use up a lot of oxygen, and you get a hypoxic or low oxygen zone, which we call a dead zone. And that comes from excess nitrogen or phosphorus. Yeah, and we said algae. Algae, fancy name for algae, or phyto, that means plant, and then free floating plankton, so phytoplankton, which, remember, phytoplankton produce most of the oxygen in our atmosphere. Okay, come back to primary productivity here in just a few minutes. Make sure you guys know the carbon cycle. Okay, central to the carbon cycle are animals releasing and other organisms, really animals, plants, and fungi, all undergo cellular respiration, which is where you take glucose and you breathe in oxygen and you release carbon dioxide and water. Or the opposite of that would be photosynthesis, which is where plants take in carbon dioxide and water and turn it into glucose and oxygen. Humans are certainly impacting the carbon cycle by burning fossil fuels. Also, volcanoes are going to release carbon dioxide. A lot of carbon dioxide dissolves in the ocean, right? And this causes ocean acidification because carbon dioxide forms carbonic acid in the ocean, which can then dissolve the carbonate ions, the calcium carbonate exoskeletons of marine organisms. And so make sure that you guys know what this formula says. CO2 plus water yields carbonic acid, H2CO3, and that is lowering the pH of the ocean over time, really hurting anything with a calcium carbonate exoskeleton, which is pretty much the bottom of the ocean food chain. It's why we should probably be concerned about this. The sulfur cycle. So this is also something you guys need to know about, and I'll mention this in class, but it was not in the study guide, but it should have been. So sulfur dioxide released by volcanoes. It can also be released by burning a coal. And when it does that, it can combine with water to form H2SO4, which can cause acid rain. And then that acid rain can acidify fresh bodies of water. So we're talking lakes, rivers, streams can decrease the pH of those. And so releasing more sulfur into the atmosphere leads to acid rain. Humans alter the water cycle, going back to the water cycle, a lot of different ways, but certainly cities are one of the biggest ways. Creates less permeable spaces. And so whenever you do that, you get less infiltration, more runoff. And if you have less trees, obviously less evapotranspiration as well. And then ways that we can kind of help deal with the altering of our cities is by doing things like creating wetlands in areas for runoff to go into and infiltrate back into the ground, basically creating more areas for infiltration. Here we have pictures of permeable pavement, green roof, cisterns, and we can see just this bottom right-hand picture has drainage from the street going directly into what's called a bioswale. And then I certainly could ask you what the impact of the water cycle on or what deforestation's impact is in the water cycle, and that would be that it decreases infiltration, increases runoff, and obviously decreases evapotranspiration as well because there are less trees. And that means less trees putting less water out into the atmosphere. And so you're going to get less precipitation as well. Remember, for a watershed calculation, that is a watershed calculation. That is where you are taking the area of a watershed times the depth of the rainfall. Make sure they're in the same units, multiply them together, and that will give you the volume of water that the watershed receives in a year. What are legumes? So remember, legumes, we just mentioned, they're key to the nitrogen cycle. They have bacteria in their root nodules, those little balls that you see in the picture, that fix nitrogen. So that means that legumes planted in your farm can add a bunch of nitrogen to your soil because they're good at taking it from the atmosphere and doing that nitrogen fixation. And then the special properties of water. We all covered this. It has a high heat capacity. It is the universal solvent, right? The fact that it has a high heat capacity means it regulates temperatures. It has low density as solvent, so ice floats, so lakes don't freeze over the winter. And then also very adhesive and cohesive. And so it's adhesive, and so it sticks to dust in the atmosphere and can form clouds. It's so adhesive, so it can travel up a tree doing evapotranspiration. And it's cohesive, which means it gives it a high surface tension. It sticks to itself, which means most water is in the liquid form. And then also it means that bodies of water have a high surface tension, which provides an area for life to live on. Right. Biotic living factors versus abiotic. And there's some examples in the pictures of both biotic and abiotic factors in an ecosystem. So remember that ecosystems are composed of biotic and abiotic factors. And that is versus communities, ecological communities, which are just the biotic factors, and then populations, which are just like an individual group of interbreeding organisms. Okay. So you guys know autotrophs, things that can produce their own food, versus heterotroph, things that can't. Another word for autotroph is produces. Another word for heterotroph is consumers. Make sure that you guys can diagram a food web, knowing that we have our producers at the bottom. And we have things that eat the producers. Those are called primary consumers. Those are herbivores. Secondary consumers eat the primary consumers, and then tertiary consumers eat secondary and primary consumers. And then decomposers bring it all back there. Detritivores are things that eat dead and decaying flesh. So Remember the 10% rule, and that's the whole idea that 10% of energy is lost with every step up the food pyramid. And so organisms that are higher up on the food pyramid, there's less energy available for them, so not many of them can be supported. Where does all this energy go? It's lost as heat, and as animals do respiration, as animals, plants, fungi do respiration, energy is lost as heat. Okay, I think we've talked about most of these objectives here. Remember that we can measure the overall productivity, which means the amount of photosynthesis an ecosystem is doing, by using some terms. So net primary productivity, gross primary productivity is how much incoming sunlight plants convert to chemical energy, and that overall percentage is about 1%. Minus those plants use some of that energy for themselves in the form of respiration, that's GPP minus respiration, equals NPP. And net primary productivity is how much energy plants pass on to the rest of the ecosystem. And then that energy is passed up each trophic level, which only 10% is because energy is lost as heat. And these just show some of the most productive ecosystems. And then swamps and marshes are kind of at the top of the list, tropical rainforest, and then lower productivity ecosystems, areas where there's not much photosynthesis because there's not much water, would be areas like a desert or open oceans, not because there's not a lot of water, but there's not a bunch of nutrients there. Now, the ironic thing is open oceans provide most of our oxygen, so do the most cumulative photosynthesis, but that's just because there's a lot of open ocean on Earth. Okay, so we are in Unit 3 here on the home stretch, so make sure we know the different levels of diversity, the diversity of different habitat areas, or this is our ecosystem diversity, the number of different species is species diversity, and within a population, the number of genes is genetic diversity. And remember that all of this is important for healthy ecosystem function. It makes ecosystems more resilient, more able to respond to change. If there's disease or some natural disaster, an ecosystem with more diversity, species diversity, genetic diversity is going to be better able to respond to change. And we can measure species diversity in a couple of ways: species evenness and species richness. And so when you're asked, like, what are characteristics of a ecosystem with that is diverse, you could say they have a lot of different types of species. That would be species richness. You could also say that there's an even distribution of those species, and that would be species evenness. So make sure you guys know the difference between those two terms. So genetic diversity is created through evolution, and there's a few ways that evolution can happen. In natural selection, sorry, that blank right there, in artificial selection, humans induce evolution in a species over time through selectively breeding plants or animals with desired traits. But let's look at natural selection. Natural selection is a relatively slow process where you have an overproduction of offspring, and there's variation within those offspring. And then some of those offspring are more able to pass on their genes because they are better adapted for the environment. They're more likely to survive and reproduce. And so natural selection, what dictates changes? The environment dictates the changes when it comes to natural selection, versus artificial selection is where humans dictate changes. Versus a third way that evolution can happen is genetic drift. And that's where you have a random skewing of the gene pool in a small population. The two examples of that are the bottleneck effect, where either a natural disaster or human activity shrinks a population. And so now you have just a few individuals with not that many different genes, and you get genetic drift via the bottleneck effect. And the other idea was the founder effect, which is where a small population moves to a new area, and they don't have that many genes, and the genes could be skewed to have more of a type of certain thing, and thus can induce evolution. And so these are the two types of genetic drift. And then eventually how speciation can happen, it can happen because there's a geographic barrier, and that's what we call allopatric speciation, or it can happen when there is no geographic barrier and just something is reproductively isolated, and that is what we call sympatric speciation. I put this picture in here because it's just the whole idea. I'm on number 61. The faster the environment is changing, the less likely a species is going to be able to adapt to that, right? So when we talk about what's the problem with climate change, things can just adapt. The problem is it's the rate at which the climate is changing, right? The rate at which the ocean is heating up. Don't give species enough time to do the process of natural selection. Let me actually just, while we're on this, let me go back here. 62, how do population size and genetic diversity influence ability to change? The more genetic diversity a population has, the more ability it will have to adapt to change. And then also a population size, the larger the population size, the more it can ably adapt to change. Okay, so when we talk ecological range of tolerance, this is the range of some abiotic condition, usually, that a species can survive in, right? And then where its sweet spot is, where it can survive, not just like stay alive, but survive, reproduce, and thrive. So we call its fundamental niche. And then within that fundamental niche, there is competition. And so the zone that a species actually exists in is called the realized niche. And this competition for the realized niche within species. So here you have two birds that can survive at all of these layers here. The yellow bird is perfectly happy, and then the red bird comes along, and then they undergo competitive exclusion. And that's the idea that no two species can occupy the same niche. And so they will niche partition, and they will now exist in different areas of, in this case, the tree. And when we talk about niches, we talk about generalist and specialist species. Specialist species have a very narrow range of conditions they can survive in, very like specific diet. These are things that are more prone to extinction. Specialist species are very common on islands versus the generalist species thrives near environmental change. The raccoon, it can thrive wherever the environment has changed. And if you want to know where the environment has changed, follow humans. And these things have a wider niche and thus are more able to adapt to change. There's an idea of an endemic species. That's a species that only exists in a specific geographic location. There's lots of endemic species on islands because they evolved on the islands and never escaped the islands. And these endemic species are more prone to extinction. Endangered animals are animals that are on the verge of extinction. Threatened organisms are on the verge of being endangered. Extirpated species are locally extinct, like the grizzly bear is extirpated from California. So it's not gone globally, but it is just extinct from a local areas. And species that are most vulnerable to extinction are species that reproduce really slowly, species that are endemic, only exist in a certain area, species that have a very narrow ecological niche. These are all examples of things that make species more vulnerable to extinction. And then, of course, things like having low genetic diversity is also going to make you more vulnerable to extinction. All right, hip coom. This is a big one here. The factors that drive the global loss of biodiversity. And so for this one, I actually just put some slides in from previous things. So we have hip coom. So H stands for habitat fragmentation, and we use the example of the northern spotted owl, where we cut down forest in the north. They almost went extinct due to habitat loss. That's the number one reason for loss of species. And this just shows you some biodiversity hotspots and where land is being changed over the year. And biodiversity hotspots, those are areas where there's high levels of biodiversity. And that's also where we're seeing some of the highest rates of forest change, especially in places like Brazil and Indonesia, tropical rainforest, where there's more species diversity. And here's just a picture of those first hotspots. We actually live in a pretty hot spot for biodiversity, given our very temperate climate. Okay, so tar sands, we talked a little bit about those. That's extracting, it's mowing down Canadian forest for the point of extraction of oil. That's an example of habitat loss. Um, and then the biggest reason for habitat loss is we've converted habitat to areas for us to grow food, to eat. All right. We also, the other H is habitat fragmentation, and that is where you can cut a habitat in half or in a lot of different pieces with a road, with a fence. And when you do this, you create more edge. And generalist species thrive and less species um, thrive on the edges. And this is called the edge effect when you have more edge because of habitat fragmentation. And then the species on the inside, the interior species, which are usually the more sensitive species, are often outcompeted by these edge species. And so cowbirds are one example that we used for this. And cowbirds are displacing a lot of native songbirds, which are the interior species. They're being replaced by the cowbird. Invasive species, these are species that are not native to an area, right? And they can, they're not native to an area and they spread rapidly because they have no natural predators and often reproduce quickly. This costs the United States billions of dollars a year to deal with. And some examples of non-native species that we talked about, I had on my list of organisms here down at the bottom, were the mongoose. We talked about zebra mussels and how they were introduced to the Mississippi River watershed, the Great Lakes, originally by the ballast waters being unloaded by a cargo ship there. And so now zebra mussels are everywhere wreaking havoc on the Mississippi River watershed, as are Asian carp, which were introduced as sport fishing species and now have no predators except for humans, I guess, and have caused huge problems in the Mississippi River water basin. Kudzu vine is another invasive species to know. That's in the southeastern United States, and it was brought in as an ornamental plant, just like here Genesta French broom was, and English ivy, and has spread rapidly. Pythons in Florida is another example of this. And then locally, we have sudden oak death fungus, which was brought in. Okay. The P stands for pollution. And make sure you guys know the difference between bioaccumulation, which is the accumulation of a toxin over time in an organism, and biomagnification, which is the increase in toxin over up the trophic level. And that means that something that cannot be urinated out, something that is fat soluble, will increase in toxin over time. And an example of that would be things that eat higher up on the food chain, such as polar bears, such as California condors, have higher levels of toxin in them. And the condor we talked about is a case study that you should know, right? It's originally almost went extinct because of DDT in the environment, causing its eggshells to be thinner. DDT is a pesticide. And then it's still not naturally increasing because there's still DDT in the environment. And then also other factors such as eating lead from carcasses that are left out there, and then also power lines. Over harvesting has and over hunting has almost, if not, so the American bison was over harvested, almost went extinct, but it's not. The American alligator was over harvested and almost went extinct, but it is still out there because we started farming them. The dodo bird is extinct, the passenger bird pigeon is extinct, and tuna, we're overfishing them, are going extinct. And climate change, this often causes what we call the elevator to extinction, which is where it causes species to shift up a mountain range, which means species at the top of the mountain range are kind of forced out and have no more habitat, outcompeted by species that can move up a mountain range. Also, distribution of species due to climate change are moving from more central latitudes to more northern and more southern latitudes. Some of those species at kind of the poles of the earth are being outcompeted by species that can now move there. Okay. About these. Okay, and I think that's all of those species here. Which group of animals are experiencing the highest rate of extinction? It's reptiles and amphibians. How is an adaptation related to a mutation? An adaptation is a beneficial mutation. Phenotype, that's what an organism looks like. Genotype, that's the genes that are actually in. Know that evolution acts on phenotype. Definition of species, the biological definition of species is organisms that can mate with each other and produce viable and fertile offspring. Okay, a couple last little things here. Single-based approach to helping species out that are endangered. We have the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which makes it so you can't kill marine animals. The Endangered Species Act, which gives the government power to actually purchase land to help preserve species. And then CITES, which is an international agreement to not trade certain endangered wildlife. Okay, and then I think, yeah, so I think that's it. Just a couple of quick notes here. Some things that I added. So we just did Unit 4. So I think all of this should be Unit 4 was the rock cycle, mining, and then soil. And then Unit 5 is agriculture and land. We are not going to end up getting to objective 156, 157, and 158, but everything else is game, including, I'll just point out a couple things. Number 137, there will be questions from the Kiss the Ground documentary specifically, and what questions should you know? All the questions on that sheet of paper that I gave you a couple of weeks ago. And then the other thing that I would want you guys to add to your study guide, which we did just talk about right now, this is going to Unit 2, which is coral bleaching, eutrophication, and the sulfur cycle. So we talked about eutrophication, we talked about the sulfur cycle. And the last thing I'll just mention is remember that coral bleaching, which we mentioned earlier, is when the coral gets stressed. Remember, coral is this combination of an animal which has a plant in its tissues, and that plant is algae called zooxanthellae. When the coral gets stressed, the zooxanthellae, the algae, go away, which the algae are feeding the coral through photosynthesis. And the coral, when they get rid of their algae, they turn white. And so that's a stressed version of coral. When they're stressed for a long time, then eventually the coral die. And the things that are stressing corals are things, the main thing is warming ocean temperatures. The coral can't survive in these warmer temperatures. And then also things like pollution and acidification also are stressing coral. But the main thing driving loss of coral worldwide is a change in the ocean temperatures, a warming of the temperatures. Okay. Hope that was helpful. I know that was a lot of stuff. I will also post some other resources under this review topic, but I'll go ahead and end this here. And thanks for watching and have a great day.